Our next presenter is Tom Adamich.
My pleasure.
And we've heard a little bit of chatter today and tomorrow about E-Motorsports, and that's what the topic of this talk is about.
No, it's not working. I got nothing. Just tell. Yes, please. Time out. Time out. That mic is not working. No.
It is working in here, but not like you.
Not in the. Not on. How's that? Are we good on that one?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, sure. No worries. I want to thank everybody for being here. I've been a presenter here for a number of times, not always in person, and I really feel like I'm among friends in that sense, that everybody I've always met here has been so kind and very generous with their comments and things, that it really does feel that way. So I think that's to the credit of people like Dawn. And I have to give a credit to the folks, you know, I'll give you a little background. My presentation isn't too long, but I want to give you some context that might help you in placing what we're going to talk about today in some sort of frame of reference. And some of it's my own personal frame of reference, so you'll have to indulge me with that. But I've been a member of SAH since 1993, and it's been a privilege to be part of that organization as well. You know, I started presenting at SAH in 2000. I was at the Peterson Museum in California, and I presented about the history of the station wagon. So, but I say that because in the next year, the next series, 2002, we were in Indiana, and I met a wonderful person by the name of Pat Young. And she was new to SAH at the time, but we became fast friends because we kind of were in that newness in the sense of being presenters, and she was a longtime English professor at the University of Houston, and so we did talk shop. I'm a librarian and archivist by trade, but we did have that common thread of being able to share some stories, and she was from San Francisco, and I have some relatives there who, and I'll be brief about that, but I had a good cousin of my mom's that went out west in the 40s after the war, and his family had worked for Bethlehem Steel back in Pittsburgh, but they migrated west and were able to make it in the new post-war California, and that really is an important piece of kind of what I'm going to talk about today, because there is a common thread that not only goes through my presentation, but went through the presentations of the last 2 days. And that theme was that there is a definite business component tied to all of this. Whether you did, you know, some may say that's not the case, but it really is very clearly evident that the success of motorsports wherever it is in the world is based on some sort of economic driver, some sort of economic glue that holds that together. And without that part or that piece, it's very difficult to maintain any continuity. And that's why I love the presentation yesterday about Watkinson's Glen and that whole idea of what happened when the economic piece was a little wonky. And that's something I think that's really very important. And also the thing that struck me about a lot of the presentations that we've had is this whole idea of society and politics and influences of those. But there's one piece that I haven't heard about, and it's the one that I do hope you will draw out of mine if you remember nothing else from my presentation. There is a religious component. And it may not have been brought out in some of those other presentations, but there is a truly Christian-based religious component involved in motorsports. And, we have freedom of religion, so I'm not advocating for any particular type of religious perspective. But I think you'll find, once I talk, you'll see where that connection comes into play. And I'm always grateful for, and I'm happy to thank God in whatever context I'm in. But I say that because I again go back to my history with this particular good group of people. There was one year that Don presented for me in proxy. I had suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, where I lost my arms and legs. I had to relearn all of my functions. So I say that because I think there's a certain aspect of being able to relate what people do in their pursuits. And let's face it, motorsports is a pursuit. It's something that people enjoy. It's an activity. It's a case of somebody that has an interest. My interest is that at the age of 4, I was identifying cars, and my dad would take, he worked for a fan manufacturer at the time. He would take clients around, and they would come and pick me up at home and ask me to drive around a little bit, and I'd identify cars, So, and in that context, there's a sense of where you look at the whole idea of what motivates you, and in my view, there's a motivation from above. And I think if you really look and dig deep into some of the things that we talked about culturally, socially, again, whatever your beliefs are, there is that intrinsic spiritual piece that I think you'll find very interesting in this particular context of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go briefly, again, this is just scratching the surface of the history of e-motorsports, because there really is a lot that you can learn, and there's a lot more to learn because the history is so brief. So it's almost a snapshot of what's happening in real time, which I think is another interesting aspect of this whole initiative, that when you look at the idea of racing, and again, mostly from a battery-powered perspective, and again, we're in the lithium-ion era, so there's new battery technology. It's still evolving and it's still growing, so that's something that I think will be interesting to track and explore in future. The other aspect of this, it's really a case of being very grounded in the idea of environmental integrity, preservation of the environment, and that's where I'll get into some of the more religious aspects of what motivates those people who are committed to some of that thought. And maybe that'll give you a little bit of understanding, at least from this perspective of what this, the people that are part of the FIA Formula E founding, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Extreme E or Extreme H, it's the rally type of racing. So it's very, very comparable and akin to that. I had the privilege, from 2009 to 2016, I was the project archivist at the Will St. Clair Auto Museum in Marysville, Michigan. For those of you who don't know, C. Howard Wills was Henry Ford's chief engineer from 1903 to 1919. He founded a car company, bought 4,300 acres of land, built a car that was over-engineered and compared to the Peugeot and Mercedes-Benz from 1921 to 1927. And so he worked very closely with Ford. And as you can see, Ford, for those of you that studied early Ford racing history, very, very much grounded in the very beginnings of Ford as a company. And for those of you who are interested, again, another aside, Cadillac was the car that was founded from the vestiges of what was Ford's first company. But that the Leyland influence and bringing that in created what was and is still today Cadillac, thankfully. The idea of what would power cars very early on in the brass era, or whatever you want to call that period of the infancy of the automobile, it really lends itself to the fact that as far as racing is concerned, really electrics and battery-powered vehicles were very much at the forefront of racing at that time period. And this profiles, that first car in France that had one of the first speed records, 62 miles per hour. So it's really interesting when you compare that to some of the speeds today and some of the horsepower that electrics even today can generate. It's a different type of power. So, but it's really interesting when you look at some of that, some of those numbers to see. And of course, back in that very early time, the carriage builders. That's why I'm so glad that Andrew was. Studebaker was an early carriage builder. Began as those carriages and then morphed into the automobile. But at this time, many of these early vehicles were electric and steam. They were certainly competing, and gas engines had not developed to that degree that they were later in that 1910 period. Throughout from 1900 to 1910 is when you saw that big leap in the development of internal combustion. So it's very interesting to look at the frame or the frame of reference of e-racing or e-speed when you're looking at this very early period of the automobile's development. And the idea of course, the internal combustion engine, the utilization of and availability of fuel, the fear, of course, electricity in rooms like we have today and homes and buildings, was still in its infancy as well. So the fear of some of the reactivity of what would happen with electricity, I think, was probably an impediment at the time of the progression of the electric as being, although when you look at some of the early electrics, there were some really great ones, and I bring in a little bit of my personal history. My dad was an engineer, designed 400 hertz three-phase motors for various applications, a lot of drive systems, mostly small motors. But he designed and represented for a company known as Hertner Electric in Cleveland, Ohio. And that company supplied and was the main engineering for the Roush and Long electrics that were very prevalent at the time. Of course, the Bakers, a lot of people are familiar with, Cleveland was the electric capital, or at least I feel it is. I guess maybe people could statistically show otherwise, but that background and understanding about that, I worked a little bit in the industry for my dad. My dad is 88. He has dementia. He knows nothing about what he did anymore. The man that had a photographic memory. And I'm not saying that I want to celebrate that today, and the reason why I'm glad to be here too, because when you watch that person go through that process, that journey, and you see where the thought processes go, it's something that it's always good to remember what was, and there again, maybe that's some of the essence of what I'm trying to tell you about this particular, when you see some of that motivation as to why these particular racing teams and particular racing venues of this most recent era have developed. When you look at some of the more recent history before what I'm going to talk about, the National Electric Drag Racing Association was one of the early, at least in this country, and I'm glad we talked a little bit about drag racing and John Forson. And the one I'm most familiar with is Don Garlitz, who I grew up in Ohio, but my teenage years I spent in Florida. So I visited in Ocala a lot and went up there and enjoyed what they have in their museum. But I say that because electrics and drag racing are very akin to each other. That quick acceleration, the transfer, that ability to really generate a lot of power quickly, and the transfer and how the motor interacts with the components is really, it's immediate. It's very, and a different feel. I know we talked and heard some comments earlier about, the kind of the feel of the race and the feel of the, of driving, and those are things that I think will probably evolve over time as the sports mature, but it's a different feeling. It's definitely a different. What we're looking at here, when you look at again the acceleration aspect, the development of battery technology. I know there were some comments earlier about in some of the Formula E that the number of times that you would have to deal with it. They had two cars and they swapped out cars instead of swapping out batteries or charging, so to speak. I think those are things that are going to evolve too, but again, these early issues were very prevalent when Alejandro Agag and the people who were involved, they were the Bill Francis of this initiative, started to think about this as a sport. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is what is Alejandro Agag's story in that sense, because he's really the driving force behind Formula E, Extreme E, Extreme H, and I'll get into the H, the hydrogen one too, a little bit. But the reason why I mentioned about religion is because when you peel back the onion and you look at what motivated that individual to want to start something like this, to want to advocate for something like this. You have to look back at his history, and you have to look back at his philosophies. And the interesting part about that is when you are somebody who was the Secretary General for the European People's Party. He was also the Secretary General for Mexico, for the Christian Democratic International Group. These are coalitions. And the European People's Party is a coalition of they are moderate conservative groups, and they are based, different ones that join together. There are 8 countries in Europe. Greece is one of them, Austria, and I have my list here: Belgium, Romania, Ireland, Poland, Portugal, Spain. Of course, Mr. Agag is Spanish, so they elected him Secretary General. He is a member of European Parliament, representing this philosophy. And the philosophy is grounded on 3 things. There is an idea of Christian democracy, which has a definite root in Christ-centric faith. It has a root in the idea of what I call the idea of personal approaches that are based on faith-based principles. If you're familiar with any philosophers, Emmanuel Neuer is a developer of personalism. Personalism is that concept that has basic principles such as a life begins at conception and lasts through natural death. That the integrity of the family is an important part of who people are, and that there is a certain amount of stewardship that's associated with being involved in being somebody that is a Christian Democrat. That those who are able can take care of those who may need or who have need. So these are faith-based principles. St. Thomas Aquinas, if you've looked at some of his philosophies and some of his writings, is another that especially in St. Thomas Aquinas, he talks a lot about stewardship and the idea of taking care of God's planet. You know, God gives us the gift of this planet, and we are to be that steward of that. And so that's where a lot of the environmental connections come into play. But there is a driver. There is an economic business driver. It's based in free market capitalism. It's based in the idea of social market economy. That's let the market decide how it works. Let the market dictate what some of the policies are, and then use that as the driver to allow for companies to prosper, and then if there is the need for social justice and social welfare, that those companies can help and distribute. And let's be honest and look at every big city in this country. When you look at, and as a librarian, when you go to a Carnegie library, that was Andrew Carnegie that made that possible. He's just an example. But you can go down the list, and I can go, you know, for all of us that are part of living or working in Michigan, go to a Henry Ford hospital. That hospital didn't get that name from out of the air, you know. And I say that maybe I'm a bit passionate about that too. I'm giving, again, a little bit of my history. My grandfather was a tire builder at Goodyear. Worked from nothing to be able to then, when he was at his point of working in retirement, he drove Oldsmobiles. And I say that because he had the ability at that job and the manufacturing infrastructure that free market capitalism promoted in this country enabled that, and enabled what Goodyear, and it's interesting not to bemoan what may have happened or some of the changes, because we have to move on in that sense, but to recognize it. And that's the case of what happened here. You know, Formula E is based on these business deals that Mr. Agag made to start this. So he was the Bill France of this, in my opinion, the Bill France of what's occurring today. And he has control over, he has a, you know, in the sense of, but when you look back of what he's trying to accomplish, then you can see that there are principles of trying to provide a pathway, an economic pathway, but also an equity and inclusion pathway. So, and you'll find that once we get into Extreme E, you'll see where that becomes evident. I've just, I encourage you, I'm sure this will be made available after the conference, so I encourage you to go through and look at some of the venues that are profiled here, and some of the, you know, it has definitely a global and a world view of what Formula E is and what it becomes, because again, these venues are areas that are worldwide. As the early days of this racing segment have progressed, the product has progressed too, and it's progressed quite rapidly as far as what it can do. Again, fewer swaps of equipment, technology has increased, and that's something, in a few slides we'll get to the point where I have direct quotes from the good people from Formula E and Extreme E and Extreme H, and I kept them as they were given to me because I want you to hear what they say and how they say it. As far as what their philosophies are and what they're trying to accomplish. They're very involved in charitable causes. Again, you know, that idea of, again, St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, be thoughtful and be able to help those in need, help those, using the vehicles and the drivers that are available from what results. And that's really important. I talk about some of the areas here that the racing network has expanded into, and some of the, again, it's really interesting when you look at some of these different advancements in the product itself. And they're, again, really based on what's available, what the ability of the racing engineering to develop over time, and that's just a little bit of a taste. Of course, knowing that he was able to do this with Formula E, he migrated and moved into the rally area, and that's where Extreme E was born. That it began in 2019. As you can see, it's showcasing electric sport utility vehicles, which there are so many of them on the market today. That SUV platform, but putting them into really extreme environments, you know, the desert conditions and those things that are really challenging from a product operation standpoint. And I can tell you from the time that I worked with my dad, and some of the, had a lot of military contracts and designs that were used in the military, desert conditions, water conditions, you know, we had to factor in some of those specifications. You know, the military was very strict on that, which is thankful, because there again, you know, when you're in a battle or a conflict situation, you need that reliability. These are their words again. The purpose of promoting electrification, environment, and equality. All teams consist of one female and one male member. That's part of the design. and those people are at parity, and they work together. So that's not a case of saying you're less, you're this. It's working together. You know, there again, that idea of, you know, family, marriage, those things, working in unison, cooperation. And these are the words, again, the series goal is to highlight the impact of climate change in some of the world's most endangered environments, promote the adoption of electric vehicles to pave the way for a lower carbon future. So they have a mission there, and to provide a world-first gender-equal motorsports platform. And again, I'm a person, I've been working for the last 3 years a lot on EV awareness, and I'm the first to say that there are pros and cons. And I'm the first to say that there are issues that will need to be addressed and developed over time. It's not a panacea. And an electric vehicle relies as much on a power plant that can generate electricity and having an infrastructure as anything. So, you know, the idea that you're just everything's going to be wind and solar is a dream at this point. Or some type of, you know, there has to be that realistic point of view, and so I'm being very honest about what I've learned. And again, I'm not giving an opinion. I'm giving just information that you can decide in how you feel about it. Again, this was probably one of the first ports to be designed from a social purpose standpoint. The environmental impact, you know, they are trying to utilize this sport as a way to test, and some of the things that I mentioned, some of the battery issues, you know, cooling, charging, the idea of battery densities. Those are things that are being addressed. The effects on motors and the control. You know, we're still in a very interesting period where we don't have a good history of how long after an EV is 10 years old, what's it going to be like? You know, how's the product going to work? Is it going to function? You know, what are the repair issues? What are the needs for having people to, I mean, from a general passenger car perspective. But of course, even in the racing environment, you know, what happens down the road? Being able to help people understand what maybe are some environmental issues that can be highlighted and a test bed for some of that. Again, evolving, not saying right, wrong, this is, you know, or everything has to be this way, but giving a little bit of a platform and a way of talking about it and looking at various aspects of the EV industry and of alternative fuels. We're not just talking EV here. So again, and as I mentioned, using the technology to be able to, and the racing as a test bed for various technology. The expansion, of course, I am interested in where this will go. Hydrogen vehicles have been talked about for probably over a decade. Toyota being one of those that was, from a passenger car perspective, very interested and very kind of ahead of the curve in that regard. But they will have an Extreme H category starting next year. And so it'll be very interesting to see how, you know, for those of you who are, and again, I'll be brief, you know, the hydrogen cell is basically the hydrogen is the fuel for the interaction between the anode and the cathode and the atoms that are associated, you know, producing water as a byproduct. And so that's in a pressurized environment. So when you are dealing with that, there are some issues that you have to, and of course hydrogen fuel, where do you get it? You know, what is the access to that? So there's still some high costs and accessibility issues, as there are with EVs. So and I'm sure everybody is familiar with what the news has reported and some of those situations. But again, it is definitely something for today, as you can see that, these things are, and these are their words. I wanted you to, I thought about, kind of putting my own spin on it and interpreting, but I wanted you to see what they are, from a philosophical standpoint, this is what they want people to think about and understand. So, and these are some of the speeds and of course the design too is very interesting in that regard of how that is able to, of course, deal with the extreme terrain of that type of rally racing, and then the environments in which they race. The idea of all of this, again, short history, but definitely something that will evolve over time and will be very influential in understanding how it will relate not only to the sport itself, but then how that will relate to the bigger picture and some of those issues that they hope to highlight. And again, they're faith-based. They really are. So it will be an interesting, and I wanted to give an acknowledgement to the good folks that were very generous with their archives and their information. That and that's a little bit about. I've operated my business since 1993. I've had traditional employment also, but I say that because I respect and have had the pleasure of working with a lot of good people through my business, and so I'm very thankful for that as well. And any questions or any comments? Or thank you. You're welcome. And that's apparently that's something that again in that Dodge discussion that was, it's the technology enables that. It's more simulated, but.
Tom, where do you see the esports going based upon what you presented? I mean, it's changed a lot. So where is our history for this? I mean, you've covered some of that. Is there anybody actually recording with your contact that you had what's going on? Because it seems to be moving very rapidly.
Well, I think there will be a body of knowledge that generates from it. I think that again, part of the Bill France model, they'll want people to look back and say, here's where things were, so they're going to, it's a marketing tool. So to have that history, knowing where you've been is how you can know where you're going. So I think that will maybe be something that will be very evolutionary, but I think that the powers that be will make sure that people can access that, and I can tell you from as a researcher, archivist, somebody, they have a great image library already set up. They have a great as far as the engagement of the governing bodies. They're very generous and very accessible. So it wasn't a case you had to dig through and figure out, I put my librarian hat to figure, who to talk to research this particular presentation. But they weren't being restrictive or they're very open with their time and their content.
Thank you. It's a great presentation.
Well,
some of those numbers at the very beginning were kind of shocking as far as like the amount of electric vehicles, amount of steam vehicles that were on the roadway prior to. But at what point did that shift dramatically? Obviously, we're nowhere near that this day. In fact, steam is, not on the road, basically. Was this kind of like a Nikola Tesla Edison situation where, just one business, so AC versus DC types thing? Or
I think it was a case of, when the shift took place to internal combustion, when that kind of 1910 period when Henry Ford really started to get ramped up. Again, I look back to Ford because they, were that initial mass production driver, and a lot of those early, before the Model T, a lot of those very early, that probably 1908 to 1910 period when they were really starting to produce and organize his, I used not only because I worked on the Wills collection as an example, but Ford was very much a developer of workforce and very much a developer of communities. He was very strict on the way his workers behaved and the way they were housed. He was very generous with his ability. If a worker needed housing, that the company tried to help him out. So that was starting to develop. And he had a sociological department, for those of you that aren't familiar with that. And Wills tried to mimic a lot of that when he developed the community of Marysville. A lot of the early workers there, the men that worked in the factory were housed in dormitories, so they had a community of practice and a community to live in, and they were very much engaged. Just like a lot of company, I remember from my own family, my grandfather, my mom, that they went to all the Goodyear functions, and even where my dad worked before he started his company, we had Christmas parties and people engaged in a community. And I say that because it really did impact how the people, when you had that support and you had that functionality, then those people went in to work and they knew somebody had their back, so to speak. They were willing to produce. So there was that kind of idea of a family, and again, I pray that continues, and I think it still exists today at a certain level, but maybe in a different way. So hope that answers your question.
How would you look at hybrids and plug-in hybrids as a bridge to new generations of low-emission vehicles?
I think it's a great option, and I don't think it should go away. There again, it might be the best option for that person that might have, or a situation, in a work situation where you might have a long haul circumstance, and you really still don't know where the charging is going to be. Our charging infrastructure still isn't well developed. Even home charging infrastructure is still very spotty and not very well understood. So having that ability to have a gas engine or have some kind of, or if you do have a hybrid that's regenerative, that's a really good option, and it's a functional one. And you look at the Toyota Prius that's been out for probably 15 years. And that car is well engineered and well designed because of that fact that they've taken that ability to utilize the technology but also to understand that the availability of fuel, whether it be charging or whether it be traditional, gasoline or that combustible fuel, is still very readily accessible, and it may be for some time as well, because the charging infrastructure, there's more pieces to that. There needs to be capacity at the electrical generation level. Lines are still being upgraded. If you really want to know about where EVs need to go, or where that whole, look at public utility or utility company plans and what they're planning to do, or where they're at. And what's involved there, because that's really the basis for that, and from the battery perspective and accessing and the alternative fuels, again, like hydrogen, they're even farther down on the development list as far as station or availability of hydrogen, so.
Anyone else?
Tom, did you look at the Dakar Rally and their alternative fuel programs and the Mission 1000.
No, tell me a little bit about it. If,
Well,
if you have some.
The Dakar Rally for the last, I think it's 2, maybe 3 years, has been promoting alternative fuels and been encouraging racers to do different things. And they've had hydrogen vehicles that have raced in electric vehicles. And then the Mission 1000 class had, I think there were 3 engine combinations that were promoted in that, which was, one was full electric, one was full hydrogen, one was a hybrid. And some of that was all actually joint ventures between, I believe it was like Honda, Kawasaki, and Yamaha. They collaborated for the Mission 1000. So I didn't know if you had looked into any of that, being that it relates sort of to like this whole Formula E, Formula H is kind of similar to that.
And have they sanctioned that? Have the governing bodies of that?
Oh, yeah.
So there again, it's another example. Like I say, I gave a brief overview of one, but I thank you for bringing that to the discussion, because there again, that shows you that it's on the radar that this is going to be an important aspect, future, you know, and so knowing that other organizations who manage racing are involved is very, and much, I appreciate your sharing that information.
Well, thank you, Tom. Certainly interesting and a very pertinent subject, so thank you very much.